Today we're going to think about heart valves. Problems with heart valves cause heart failure and are an important cause of diseases in children and adults. Rheumatic fever is unfortunately really common in New Zealand. Knowing about the pathogenesis of rheumatic fever will help you explain to patients why they should take their penicillin and why it's important to keep coming back so that you can ensure better health for them. These are the key concepts about rheumatic fever. Acute rheumatic fever results from an immune cross-reaction to cardiac antigens following a group A strep infection. Acute rheumatic fever causes inflammation in the myocardium and pericardium as well as the valves. It's a pancarditis. The inflammation caused by acute rheumatic fever heals by scarring, and this leads to chronic rheumatic heart disease with valve stenosis and regurgitation. The illustration on the right here shows the pathogenesis of rheumatic fever. First we have group A strep attaching to the pharyngeal epithelium. This causes generation of antibodies. These antibodies cross-react with proteins in the heart. On the endothelium, the valvular endothelium, they react to proteins. And then, when they're sitting there, they recruit a whole lot more inflammatory cells. Once the inflammatory cells arise, well, then we have fibroblasts and blood vessels and the whole cascade happening that causes acute rheumatic fever. But this isn't just happening in the endocardium. It's also happening in the pericardium, where it results in a fibrinous exudate. You can hear this clinically as a pericardial rub. Myocarditis is caused by the similar immune reaction happening in the heart muscle. It causes the heart muscle to become soft and flabby. The heart can dilate and acute heart failure can develop. A lot of the action, though, is in the endocardium. Inflammation of the valve cusps means they become vascularized, red and swollen. Inflammation of the chordae tendineae means they're also inflamed and red. Then, along the edge of the valve, you can get endothelial ulceration and small thrombi form, particularly along the lines of closure. In this illustration, you can see these little thrombi forming on the edge of the valve. We call these thrombi vegetations. What do you predict will be the changes in chronic rheumatic fever based on these acute changes? In chronic rheumatic fever, the problems are due to scarring. The mitral valve is affected in 90% of cases. It develops a kind of fish mouth appearance due to thickening and contraction of the cusps and fusion of the commissures. The valve neither fully opens nor fully closes, and the chordae are thick, confused and shortened, which means the valve doesn't fully close. The result is both mitral stenosis and regurgitation. In this valve, you can see the fish mouth appearance. Both the anterior and posterior mitral leaflets are really thick and quite short, and the commissures around the edges, they're joined together. This means this valve is permanently open, and it can't open any more than it is. There's just this small hole for blood to get through, causing both stenosis and regurgitation. The aortic valve is affected in 25% of cases. In these cases, the mitral valve is also affected. Just like the mitral valve, the cusps become thickened and contracted, so the valve does not fully close. And the cusps become thickened and stiff with calcified nodules behind the cusps, so the valve also doesn't fully open. Again, the commissures are fused. resulting in poor opening of the valve. The result is again aortic stenosis and regurgitation. In this illustration, you can see a stenotic valve where it doesn't really close very well, and then it also doesn't open. Imagine all the murmurs going on in this heart with rheumatic fever. You're going to have ones resulting from the aortic valve and the mitral valve, ones in both diastole and systole. Why don't you have a listen to a website that shows all the murmurs that can happen in rheumatic heart disease? There are other kinds of valve disease, particularly degenerative valve disease, that can affect older people or younger people if they have a bicuspid aortic valve. Bicuspid aortic valves are relatively common, affecting 1 to 2% of the population. They're due to fusion of two of the aortic valves during fetal life. The increased wear and tear on the valve causes early degenerative change and aortic stenosis, and sometimes regurgitation. Age-related calcific degeneration of the aortic valve is a similar process. In this illustration, we can see a bicuspid aortic valve. There are only two leaflets. Look at the really big calcific nodules sitting behind each leaflet. Here is a normal tricuspid valve. It's also showing degenerative changes with these fibrous and calcific nodules impairing its opening. This is how age-related degeneration looks. The third type of degenerative valve disease is mitral valve prolapse, also called floppy mitral valve. Mitral valve prolapse occurs in 1 to 3% of the population. It's usually incidental and asymptomatic. Occasionally, it's associated with Marfan syndrome. The valve becomes thick and weak, resulting in increased valve area and elongated chordae tendineae. This means that the valves billow back into the left atrium, causing mitral regurgitation. In this illustration, the degenerate mitral valve doesn't close properly. You can see it ballooning back and thus causing a channel where blood can regurgitate back into the atrium. The problem with valvular heart disease is that it can affect the function of the heart. Valvular dysfunction leads to heart failure. This is a key idea. There are two ways that heart failure can occur. Pressure overload, such as with aortic stenosis, leads to left ventricular concentric hypertrophy. Volume overload, such as with mitral regurgitation, leads to dilation. In the case of mitral regurgitation, it leads to atrial dilation, and thus atrial fibrillation. Another thing that can happen with damaged valves is that they can become infected. They can either become infected with low-grade organisms, such as strep viridans, which leads to subacute endocarditis with large vegetations. Virulent organisms, such as Staph aureus, lead to destruction of the valve, holes, abscesses. And both these can have complications from embolism of the vegetations around the arterial tree. Here we have a heart with subacute endocarditis. Notice how big those vegetations are compared to the ones in rheumatic fever. This image, taken down a microscope, shows a large clump of bacteria, the dark blue area, attached by a small stalk to the underlying heart valve. Imagine how easily those bacteria are going to break off and embolize around the body. When embolism occurs from these vegetations, one of the easily spotted signs is splinter hemorrhages. Now, splinter hemorrhages can occur from a wide variety of things, like just injuring the nail bed, but multiple of them without a history of injury is a key feature that tells you to look for infective endocarditis. Here we have a spleen with multiple abscesses in it. They're the pale areas near the capsule. When bacteria break off and travel around the body, they can cause abscesses in a wide variety of organs, particularly ones with a high blood flow, like the brain and the kidneys. Like many parts of medicine, there are eponymous names associated with infective endocarditis. Osler's nodes are these large areas on the palm which are firm, raised and tender. In the eye, Roth spots are due to small hemorrhages resulting from emboli. And then there are Janeway lesions, which are tiny spots on the palm of the hand caused by microinfarcts. I can never think of Janeway lesions without thinking of Star Trek Voyager. So we've thought about the vegetations that occur in rheumatic heart disease and in infective endocarditis, but there are two more situations in which vegetations occur. The first is called non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis. Here, small sterile vegetations are deposited on the valve leaflets. They occur in hypercoagulable states and malignant cancers. The final place where vegetations often occur is in systemic lupus erythematosus. Small sterile vegetations are deposited on both sides of the valve leaflets in this condition. This slide compares the four types of vegetations in endocarditis. You can see the small linear ones in rheumatic fever, the really big ones in subacute endocarditis, the medium-sized ones in non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis, and the ones on both sides of the valves in SLE. These latter ones have a special name, Liebman-Sachs endocarditis. On your journey to becoming a great clinician, you've learnt about the things that injure valves. It's important now to relate those to what kind of murmurs they might have. By understanding how valves are injured and what results from that injury, you can understand murmurs and you can become a great clinician. You're on your way to becoming a pathology superhero.